Hello, welcome to Unit 5 of the Soil Restoration course. In this unit, we will be talking about ectomycorrhizal fungi and saprotrophic fungi. So these are the two major groups of fungi in certain ecosystems that contribute to nutrient cycling. First of all, we'll look at the different types of mycorrhizal symbiosis and how this ectomycorrhizal fungal symbiosis fits into it in terms of the kinds of plants that they form relationships with and how that symbiosis functions. We'll look at the role of both of those fungal groups in nutrient cycling, and we'll investigate the fascinating area of ecology of these fungi within forest ecosystems and look at their interactions, their ecological relationships to other organisms, for example, like the organisms that feed on fungi and how that affects their roles and nutrient cycling. And then finally, we'll look at how fungi interact with fire in terms of the use of fire in ecosystems and what happens to fungi since they are the major drivers of ecosystem function, how that affects the entire ecosystem when fungi are burnt. Okay, so this is Unit 5 in a nutshell, so let's get started. So in today's lesson, in Lesson 5.1, we'll look at the two classes of fungi called basidiomycetes and ascomycetes because they contain both the ectomycorrhizal fungi and the saprotrophic fungi that we want to look at in detail. We'll look at the general life cycle of fungi, just in general how the fungi reproduce via spores by forming the fruiting body or the mushroom, and also how fungi then gain nutrients as well from the environment. Then we'll look at the different types of mycorrhizal symbioses, because there are several of those, and the types of plants they actually partner up with. And then really concentrate on the ectomycorrhizal fungi and look at their way of cycling nutrients, and specifically we'll look at the carbon cycle. So as we already know, the fungal kingdom is very diverse and it's tricky to divide the kingdom into the subgroups because there are so many overlapping similarities and differences, and it's been really tough for taxonomists to do this. But all we want to do is concentrate from now on these two phyla, the Basidiomycota and the Ascomycota. So they are fungi that produce fruiting bodies, and we're going to look at the decomposer fungi in these two phyla and the ectomycorrhizal fungi specifically. And you can look all this up and look at the taxonomy if you want to. We won't go into it. It's quite complex and we don't want to deviate from the subject matter. But if you want to look at that, it's an interesting subject to investigate. So we have covered the vascular mycorrhizal fungi already, and that's the glomeromycota. And you can see they're sort of quite different in the way that they phylogenetically fit into the tree of life. Fungi are eukaryotic cells, so that means they have organs or organelles inside of them that are membrane bound. And what that means is that, for example, the nucleus has a membrane around it that contains chromosomes. So they are cells that are very structured and have specific function in specific compartments within the cell. Then this means that they are eukaryotes. They also have a cytoskeleton that organizes the cell structure, and they have a mechanism to divide. That cell has a dividing mechanism that allows for reproduction. Some fungi come in the form of individual yeasts, and they are microscopic unicellular organisms. That means that one cell is the entire individual versus multicellular. And the multicellular fungi actually grow through the formation of hyphae, which are apically elongating filamentous cells. So that move forward at the tip cell. And we have discussed this in the last lesson, and we might go into it a little bit later as well. They also possess in their cell walls, unlike plants which have cellulose in their cell walls, fungi have chitin and glucans, so that distinguishes them from plants. And so far there have been around 150,000 species that have been described or named, but there are estimates that go all the way to up to 10 million fungi species that are potentially out there, and a more perhaps realistic number is that of 3.8 million. I can see why scientists are estimating up to 10 million because there's just such a vast kingdom and constantly we are finding new species, and there's a whole world of microfungi as well as macrofungi, and we haven't even scratched the surface. So this is why the estimates are quite large, because anything's really possible. So basidiomycetes The reason why they are called that is because their spores are produced on basidia. And basidia are these cute little club-shaped structures with these two little protrusions, sometimes more than two, I think, and they just basically form the spores on that protrusion. So you can think of them as this little devil structure with two little horns, and they produce these gorgeous spores that come off. So that's the basidium. And the basidium is actually on the gills or on the pores. Some fungi, of course, have pores instead of gills. And this way of reproducing through the basidia is shown here in an enlargement. So on the tip of the gill, we've got the basidia with these spores being produced, and then those spores fly off into the atmosphere. The difference between these two groups is that ascomycetes produce their spores in asci or asci, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And usually there's 8 spores produced in these. So they're basically spore-bearing structures, and they differ in the way they produce those spores and the structure that they use to produce those spores. So how do fungi feed? How fungi actually gain nutrients from their environment? If they're symbiotic, they will receive sugars. If they're connected to a plant root, so if they're ectomycorrhizal or bascular mycorrhizal fungi, they will receive these nutrients through the hyphae. But a bascular mycorrhizal fungi, as we know, don't form fruit. But ectomycorrhizal fungi and saprotrophic or decomposer fungi form what we call the sporing body or fruiting body, or the sporocarp, which is the scientific way of describing this shape, but basically a mushroom. And they do this, they produce these sporing bodies to basically release their spores and to be able to colonize plants or wood or whatever it is that they're going to be feeding on. So the hyphae or the mycelium network, with many of the hyphae coming together, exist either underground or in the wood, depending on what the fungi are feeding on. And if we take that one strand or a hypha, this is the hypha, so it's a fungal cell that it's elongated apically at the tip, elongating forward. And this tip cell actually secretes digestive enzymes. And the enzymes then come in contact with whatever nutrient source the fungi desires. So they could be breaking down rock, for example, to take that back for an exchange of carbon back to the plant. Or they could be wanting to decompose wood, and they're getting their nutrients from that. So those enzymes are directly excreted onto the wood or into soil. Those enzymes and acids as well, particularly in dissolving minerals from rock. Acids are also used to gain those nutrients from the rock, and then the fungal cell absorbs those nutrients. So either from wood or from the soil, these nutrients are taken in. And some, of course, fungi feed on insects as well. So that substrate or the food source might be a varied thing depending on what that specific species of fungi requires. And then that's taken up into the hyphae, and there's beautiful organelles, for example, like the vacuoles, and they actually take those nutrients in and move those nutrients within the cells and across to other cells, and it then comes back to the colony to feed the entire organism. And when the food source is good and there's moisture and the fungi are happy, they will produce these fruiting bodies or sporocarps to then release mature spores and reproduce. And that's a very, very complex. Fungal reproduction is super complex. We won't go into this. It's beyond the scope of this unit and the course. But if you want to get into fungal genetics, it's a whole new universe that you're going to involve yourself in, which is very, very intriguing and extremely complex. So mycorrhizal symbioses have various forms. And I'll just describe the main ones that have been provided in this paper here called Mycorrhizal Ecology and Evolution, the Past, the Present, and the Future. So you're more than welcome to grab that and have a read. And I'll summarize pretty much what that article is about. But here we have the familiar arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. That's image A and image B. And you can see the arbuscules being formed here and the hyphae going through the cell, and it's a very intimate relationship where the fungi are actually invited into the plant cells to be able to form these arbuscules and these vesicles as well, and sort of invade the fungal cells, you could say. But it's a symbiosis where there's an exchange of nutrients, so both partners usually benefit from this relationship. Now here in image C and D we have the ectomycorrhizal type of fungi, and they grow a fungal mantle around the root. So this is the root, cross section of a root, and you can see that the hyphae don't go inside the cell, but they form this fungal network around the root, completely surrounded, and then weave around the cells within the plant. And they never penetrate the cells. They literally just weave around and exchange nutrients into the surroundings of the cell. So this is what it looks like, a cross-section of a root that's colonized with ectomycorrhizal fungi. And this is an image that shows a root that's covered in this mycelium, and this mycelium completely takes over the root. The hyphae intertwine, and it looks like almost like part of the root, just covering it entirely. Then we've got the orchid mycorrhiza, and that is specific to orchids, where the seeds to germinate, they actually require these fungi to help them, because orchids normally don't photosynthesize early on in their life, and so they require the fungi to feed them very early on, and also they are extremely tiny and vulnerable, so they partner up with a fungal symbiont, and that really helps the orchids to grow. And you can see the fungal hyphae here inside the plant cell. And the last one, the last mycorrhizal symbiosis, is that of the ericoid mycorrhizal fungi and the family of plants called Ericaceae. Usually these plants live in very nutrient-poor acid heathland soils, so they require this mycorrhizal symbiosis we can see in the image. Majority of plants, 74% plants and around 200,000 plant species are mycorrhizal with the abascular mycorrhizal type that we have covered in Unit 4. About 20,000 species of plants form this ectomycorrhizal relationship, and sometimes this relationship can be very specific, where only one fungi forms a relationship with a specific host, but sometimes one plant might have several different ectomycorrhizal fungi and abascular mycorrhizal fungi, so many trees have these relationships. And also some ectomycorrhizal fungi form relationships with several different types of plants. And usually these are tree and shrub symbiotic relationships. Grasses and forbs, the lower successional plants, basically have abascular mycorrhizal fungi. And also abascular mycorrhizal fungi partner up with many different types of plants. So they're not host specific like some of the ectomycorrhizal species are. So about 2% of plants are actually ectomycorrhizal, and that's about 6,000 plant species. The orchid mycorrhiza is a very host-specific phenomenon, and 25,000 plants that are orchids engage this symbiosis. They also have this capacity to consume nutrients from the soil as well, so they're not like as desperate to be in a relationship with the plant as their abascular mycorrhizal fungi. And some ectomycorrhizal fungi can also feed off nutrients that are present in the soil and don't necessarily have to have the host for their growth immediately. And so there's a notion that maybe they were originally all saprotrophic or decomposer fungi and then became ectomycorrhizal and orchid mycorrhizal fungi. So there's this evolutionary step that might have happened where they've lost their ability to really decompose organic matter, but they will get nutrients from soil if the plant is not present. The ericoid mycorrhizal fungi in the family Ericaceae, they're very understudied, so only 1% of plants are known to have this symbiosis, and this is probably much larger, except that it's severely understudied, so we just don't know much about this particular symbiosis. So we know that there are about 40 to 50,000 mycorrhizal fungal species, and about a half to 10% of total of 500,000 to 10 million estimated species are actually mycorrhizal. Mycorrhizal fungi are known to exist in almost every single ecosystem, especially that they partner up with the bryophytes, that includes the mosses and the liverworts and plants like that. So they do occur across all ecosystems, so they're most likely to be there, except for really early successional communities. So when, for example, weeds grow that are very fast growing, fast reproducing, these fungi don't even get a chance to colonize those plants. And things like Brassicaceae or brassicas, they really don't like partnering up with mycorrhizal fungi at all. They just want to grow on their own. They've got their roots set up to be able to get the nutrients that they desire, and there's no need for the symbiosis. It really develops later on in succession. They also don't occur in intensively managed fields. and in extremely phosphate impoverished soils. If we intensively manage a field, we basically destroy the mycelium, we destroy the hyphae. So even though fungi will be present, they will not be in large abundance. And the same happens when phosphate's not present. Then these fungi cannot gain phosphate for the plant. And the only plants that can grow in these extremely phosphate impoverished soils are those that produce cluster roots. And that's like just their adaptation to being able to withstand extremely low phosphate levels. So this is how we divide the mycorrhizal symbioses into these four groups, and we'll concentrate on the ectomycorrhizal fungi. So these are examples of what it looks like to be a plant and have this ectomycorrhizal symbiosis happening on your roots. And you can see in this image here on the left, we've got this plant root and it's just very little. There are not that many of them and they're not very developed, but you can see the fungi, the mycorrhizal network is spreading and increasing that soil surface area reach of the plant and getting those nutrients. So you can imagine how important it is for seedlings to actually be connected to this network. And you can see here, this older seedling is now also sharing its nutrients to help the little seedlings grow via this mycorrhizal network, via these hyphae, this mycelium, where it's connecting one plant and it's colonizing the next. And before these can even photosynthesize for themselves, they might be getting some photosynthetic compounds from this middle larger seedling. So ectomycorrhizal fungi form root symbiotic partnerships with trees and shrubs, extracting minerals from rocks and soil to feed their host plants in exchange for plant sugars, and several hundreds of species can coexist in a single forest. So that's really lovely, and of course there's a lot of scientific stories written about this, and you can see also that these roots are completely covered in this beautiful mycelium, this fluffy velvet-like mycelium covering these roots, just completely encasing them, so they literally change their shape. They look different when they're covered in mycorrhizal mycelium. So it's just a lovely symbiosis. So we have already described this avascular mycorrhizal fungal symbiosis, but I want to stress that the ectomycorrhizal fungal symbiosis is the one that produces mushrooms oftentimes, and it grows around the cells and feeds the plant via the exchange across the cell membrane of the plant and the fungal cells. It forms a thing called a mantle, so that's where a lot of mycelium is growing around, and you can see that thickness of like fur almost around the root. And then this inside web-like mycelium that grows around the cells is called the Hartig net. That's just a name of the guy, I think, that discovered or has described this phenomenon. And with our vascular mycorrhizal fungi, as we have already covered in depth, it's the spores, and there's no fungal fruiting structure really formed. I think there might be like one species or something that does that, but the reproduction occurs via these spores and the mycelium continuation throughout the soil and the plant always present. So that's just an important thing to remember, that this avascular mycorrhizal fungi, they will partner up with many different plant species across different ecosystem successional stages, whereas ectomycorrhiza are more likely to be associated with trees and shrubs. I've already mentioned this in Unit 4, but we can say that mycorrhizal fungi are symbiotic root extensions of over 90% of all plants. There are normally mutualistic relationships between a fungi and a plant, where both partners benefit, and it's a nutrient delivery and exchange system that happens between the fungal and plant cells. And the fungal network can provide 1,000 times greater absorptive area than roots, and up to 20% faster plant growth, because the fungi keep demanding that photosynthetic exudate from the plant, so the plant keeps photosynthesizing and getting nutrients from the fungi and therefore grows better and larger and provides many benefits, as we have so far learned. And this is what it looks like on a very, very enlarged scale with an electron microscope. You can see all the hyphae completely encasing the entire root very, very coherently and entirely. And the hyphae then come off and bring nutrients to that root. So beautiful image of fungi covering a root. So this just is to demonstrate that exchange between the fungal cell, delivering those mined nutrients they get normally from the soil, from bacteria and rocks, and from the sand, silt, and clay, and then they pick up from the soil matrix, from those aggregates that they normally dwell in as the extra radical or extracellular mycelium that's sitting out in the soil, and they bring that nutrient to the plant as the plant requires it, and the plant in exchange feeds these fungal cells with carbon exudates, which are often hexoses, which is just a form of sugar that the plant forms and feeds the fungi via that. And then the fungi, of course, the cells can then share that sugar as they go out into the soil, and that feeds other organisms. And it's just a lovely mutualistic and giving symbiosis, depending on the conditions that this symbiosis exists in. We've seen this image as well already, but I cannot stress enough the importance of it. It's the carbon cycle and the role of plants and mycorrhizal fungi in this carbon cycle, as well as the decomposer fungi. So our waste, our carbon dioxide, enters the plant, and through this magical process of photosynthesis, where water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight are combined to produce photosynthetic carbon compounds, which we can call sugar. And as a byproduct, by forming this sugar, oxygen is released, which we rely on for our very own breath. And this carbon then is used by the entire plant, but also it is shared with these fungi on the roots that we call mycorrhizal fungi. And we can call these sugars also carbohydrates. And this sugar then flows down to the fungi, and in exchange, they will exploit the surrounding soil for minerals and give those minerals and vitamins and other things that the plant requires. And of course, when the hyphae die, and also the sugars that they excrete, that becomes potentially organically bound carbon in the soil and can be kept in the soil depending on the conditions in the soil and moisture, and it can be bound and left in there. And the same happens when the tree drops its limbs. The organic matter that the tree drops down is also decomposed by decomposer fungi and utilized to feed the plants and the entire soil ecosystem. But also, we have to have enough saprotrophic fungi or decomposer fungi to then break down this organic matter and actually produce food for other organisms and sequester that carbon that is no longer able to be further decomposed when it reaches its final stages of decomposition by going through several species of different organisms, but especially the fungi and bacteria. When that happens, that soil organic carbon is then the result, becoming humic acids and forming humus. So this is a very complex process, and we'll have a whole lesson on soil carbon and how important fungi are and their role in this carbon sequestration. But this is once again a very complex science that needs to be further investigated, and scientists are continually looking at how to investigate carbon sequestration into soil. But fungi specifically and the plant fungal symbiosis is very, very important in that process, in the carbon sequestration process. So, ectomycorrhizal fungi can actually receive up to 50% of carbon and give 80% of phosphorus and nitrogen and other nutrients back to the plant. So, 80% of the plant nutrients come from the ectomycorrhizal fungi. And there are also plants called mycoheterotrophs, and these plants are ones that don't have photosynthetic capacity, and they basically rely on the fungi to feed them. So imagine a plant just growing here, and it's just basically getting some carbon from the tree via the fungal network. So they're sort of seen as getting nutrients for free without having to provide photosynthetic sugars to the fungi. So no one really knows what their role in ecosystems is, but there must be something. They're not just growing there as freeloaders. In nature, everything has a role, and so therefore these plants are definitely contributing in some way. We just haven't discovered how yet. Now, another great thing about having mycorrhizal fungi is that they actually prevent nutrient leaching and losses. So they reduce nitrogen leaching by around 70 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, and they reduce phosphate leaching of 150 grams per hectare per year. So they basically prevent this leaching and losses of nutrients by having nutrients inside of them. They hold on to these nutrients. They also form aggregates and bind minerals and things to themselves. They're very good at cycling, recycling, and holding on to what normally could just run off out of the soil and pollute rivers. So very important organisms in keeping nutrients in the soil, keeping them bound and sequestered and shared and cycled. So fungi are extremely important in ecosystems, as you can see. So now we have come to the end of lesson 5.1. And in lesson 5.2, we'll talk about the benefits of ectomycorrhizal fungi. We'll look at the concept of the wood wide web, that of mycorrhizal networks, and how that functions in ecosystems and how it connects entire ecosystems by plants having mycorrhizal fungi on their roots. We'll also look at the interspecies nutrient exchange via those networks, and just within the ectomycorrhizal fungal symbiosis and its interaction between plants as well as different organisms. We'll also look at the role of ectomycorrhizal fungi in disturbance, such as mining sites and under the pressure of climate change. So you'll be seeing me again in lesson 5.2. Bye for now.